Okay, I'm talking in a more hushed voice for the remainder of this lecture, only because my son is sleeping and I don't want to wake him up, although I'm sure I will. The Federal Reserve System as a whole is the central bank for the United States. And so what that means for us here is it was created in 1913 largely because there was a quite severe recession in 1909. And it was so bad that the richest people in America, Carnegie's, Rockefellers, J.P. Morgan, I think especially, had to bail out the United States. And if you remember, this was a time when they were like anti-monopoly, anti-rich people, the progressive era. And so the idea was that we shouldn't be held hostage to rich people, so we should create a central bank like other countries have. The U.S. had tried a few other times to have a central bank, and they would exist for a while and then they would fail. But this is the one we've now had for the past 103 years. Now, it's actually not part of the federal government. This is members of the Board of Governors are selected by the President and confirmed by the Senate, but otherwise the Federal Reserve is not part of the government at all. Now, what that means for us in terms of the Board of Governors is that the Board of Governors has then 7 members. These 7 members, again, appointed by the President, confirmed by the Senate. And then there are 12 district banks. After college, I worked for the district bank in Chicago, District 7, if I'm not mistaken. We are part of District 12, I think. Our branch is located in San Francisco. What these 12 district banks do is they basically divide the country up into 12 areas, kind of like Hunger Games style. But what these district banks do then is they basically take care of the nuts and bolts that keep a currency system working in the United States. They distribute the currency, they get rid of bad currency, torn up currency, they make sure the checks are clearing, and they're the bank for the government as a whole. And again, there's our Board of Governors, there's our 12 banks. Okay, so I'd started to write this before and then he fell asleep. There's a typo here. It's FOMC, not FMOC. It's FOMC, and they did spell it right here. So the most important committee within the Federal Reserve System is called the Federal Open Market Committee. And what this Federal Open Market Committee does, as I wrote out here, is it buys and sells existing government debt. So the central bank, the Federal Reserve, holds a lot of U.S. government debt. Now, the reason why they hold a lot of government debt is because, remember, the central bank is creating and destroying the money supply as they see fit, right? To grow the economy, they're going to expand the money supply, to shrink the money supply, right? They could shrink the money supply as well if we were in too good of an economy. But you can't just print money. Like, how would you distribute it, right? And they can't just destroy money. How would you decide whose money to destroy? That's why they buy and sell the existing debt, because when the government buys, when the central bank buys, it's adding money because the Federal Reserve is printing the cash to buy that existing debt. When the Federal Reserve sells the debt that it has, it gets paid for it, and then it destroys the money. And that's how then the central bank changes the money supply. Well, this decision of whether the Federal Reserve should buy or sell, that decision is made by the Open Market Committee. Another key feature that the central bank does is it actually is the lender of last resort. That means that when no one else will lend any money, the Federal Reserve will step in. We saw this most recently during the financial crisis when $2 trillion was lent out by the Federal Reserve to banks that would have otherwise failed. Had the central bank not intervened, the recession would have been worse. And in fact, most of the time when we complain about the Federal Reserve, we complain about the fact that they did not lend to Lehman Brothers. Okay, and again, I kind of wrote these out, but let me re-explain these here. So then the Federal Reserve has three things at its disposal in terms of how they're going to then change the money supply. They're either going to change the reserve requirements, they're going to change the discount rate, which is the interest rate that the Federal Reserve charges for loans it makes to banks, or it's going to engage in the open market operations. That's the buying and the selling of the debt. So let's talk about the reserve requirement. The reserve requirement is, again, what the Federal Reserve says that banks have to minimally set aside. Well, when banks have excess reserves, they can lend that money to other banks. That interest rate is known as the federal funds rate. As the Federal Reserve Bank adjusts the reserve, let's say it lowers the required reserve ratio, then banks can lend out more money. That increases the money supply. When would the Federal Reserve ever say to banks, you can lower your reserve requirement? They would do that during a recession. The opposite is going to be true during an inflationary gap. As for the discount rate, this would be the interest rate that banks are charged when they borrow from the Federal Reserve. If the Federal Reserve is lending out money, they have to print that cash to lend it out. If they lower the interest rate that they're charging, then more banks would borrow from the Federal Reserve, which would mean that the Federal Reserve would have to print more cash to lend to all these banks that are borrowing from it. That would increase the money supply. And then we have our open market operations. Just to repeat what I had said before, if the Federal Reserve decides to sell existing debt, then they're going to collect the cash and they're going to destroy it. If the Federal Reserve decides to buy existing debt, they're going to have to print cash to buy it, and that's going to increase the money supply, M subscript S. They would sell the debt if they were in an inflationary gap. They would buy the debt if we were in a recessionary gap. And what the Federal Reserve then does is it targets then the interest rate that they want. So this is actually what is meant when people say that the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates or raised interest rates. They actually mean that the Federal Reserve changed its targeted federal funds rate. Because the central bank actually doesn't outside of the discount rate, doesn't determine interest rates. But what they can do is get it so that banks charge the rate that they want. And they can do that through their open market operations. Now, much like fiscal policy, which had time lags, monetary policy has the same problems. Monetary policy does work faster than fiscal policy, but the big problem, like fiscal policy, is that you have to recognize that there's a problem and you're getting the data pretty late. Also, the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee doesn't meet all the time. Given the flow of data that's coming in, you could only really get decisions made on a every 2-month basis. The problem that exists right now is what happens now that interest rates are essentially near zero. Because the problem is that if another recession were to happen, what could we do? We can't really increase the money supply more. We've already increased it as much as possible. That's kind of the thing that economists are now thinking about, is like, well, what do we do now? How do we stimulate the economy when we've already used all the tools that we have? So economists are starting to have to come up with some new tools. Those new tools would be things like what's called quantitative easing, or QE. There would also be some lending through some auction facilities. That would be auctions for existing debts. And they're actually starting to buy mortgages as well. A little scary. Okay. That kind of concludes this chapter, and then we just have one more chapter left.